There are stories that are not told in the light of day, not because they are not important, but because the world is not ready to listen. There are letters that are not published, not quoted, not included in any university textbook. They are passed down in whispers through the dusty corridors of those who dare to look beyond the walls of reason. Carl Gustav Jung, the founder of modern psychoanalysis, the man who sketched out the concept of the collective unconscious, the man who spent his life delving into the depths of the human soul, also had an experience that he never put into books. An experience that he himself called beyond the threshold of death. In 1944, Jung was hospitalized for a massive heart attack. In his medical records, the doctors clearly recorded, heart stopped, consciousness disappeared, a few minutes of emptiness, but in those few minutes, according to a letter that has never been officially published, he left his body. Not a dream, not an illusion, a real separation with a clearer, sharper perception than when he was alive. The letter was not sent to any research institute. It was not intended for the general public. It was written to a friend, a colleague, whom Jung identified only by his initials. The letter, after decades of floating around in a private collection, was eventually found by the recipient's nephew, who decided to copy it and give it to a documentary filmmaker. And so we learn what Jung himself had wanted to keep hidden. In the letter, Jung wrote, "I left my body. There was no more pain, no more sense of time. I saw the earth, a blue sphere, exactly like the images that NASA would take decades later. But at that time, those images did not exist." The question is not, is this real? But rather, why would a leading scientist, someone who relied on analysis and symbolism, choose silence? Have you ever felt something that you couldn't explain, but knew for sure was real? A recurring dream, a moment of silence so deep that you could hear yourself, a feeling that someone or something was waiting for your attention. If you're listening, you've probably felt that tiny crack where reality begins to crack, revealing a part of the truth that we're not ready to face. And maybe, like Jung, you've stood in front of that door, not open, not closed, just shaking. And the question remains, if you looked through, would you dare to enter? Jung reported that he did not feel lost. On the contrary, when his heart stopped beating, he felt something he had never experienced before, absolute relief. It was as if his entire body, with all its burdens, limitations, and pains, had suddenly dissolved into air, returning him to a deeper, more primitive self, unbound by matter. "I was not sucked up, nor was I lifted up, as the fairy tales tell us," he wrote. "I was simply no longer in my body. And the first thing I saw was the earth, a blue sphere, silently rotating in the vastness of space. No borders, no countries, no wars, no people, just a great life breathing in silence." Jung admitted that in 1944, he had never seen a photograph of the planet from space. So why did the image appear so clearly in his mind? Not as an illusion, but as an objective, sharp, vast reality. He continued, "The earth is no longer home. It is beautiful, but strange. I no longer belong to it." The words are few, but the feeling it evokes is clear. A slight sadness, like when you look back at your childhood through a glass window, unable to return, no longer a part of it, but still full of love and regret. Slowly, he felt himself drifting further away, no longer held, no more time, no more name, no more Carl Jung. "I did not have the feeling of I am dying," he said. "It was just, I was returning." This is one of the key points that differentiates Jung's experience from many other near-death accounts. He saw no tunnel, no light, at the end of the tunnel. Instead, there was a vast space where he could still observe, feel, think, but everything was no longer limited by language or logic. Death, for him in that moment, was not an end, but a release. Not a loss, but a return to something larger, more peaceful, more primal than any state of being he had ever experienced. There was no more noise, he wrote. There was no more pain, but there was no more individuality. I knew I existed, but I did not know who I was. And that did not frighten me. On the contrary, it made me feel right. Perhaps for most of us, the idea of losing our ego, losing our identity, is something terrifying. But for Jung, who spent his life peeling away the ego, analyzing the layers of masks that the human psyche wears, the complete shedding of the individual self was not destruction, but a return to what he called the eternal self, the deepest part of each person's soul, unaffected by time, language, memory, or society. Interestingly, when death approached, the only thing that remained was not an image, not a word, but a feeling, a peace, an indescribable silence. Not the terrifying silence of solitude, but the silence of presence, where every question had an answer, even without anyone saying it. And it was then that he began to feel pulled, not by anyone, but by an irresistible guiding force, light, steady, and not threatening at all, like an unspoken invitation, not to move forward, but to step into something else entirely, a reality that no longer belonged to the old world. That was the moment Jung understood that death was not a closed door, but a threshold to something deeper than life, a space where the last limits of consciousness also dissolved. There was no map to that place, no definition, only presence and a single feeling. Yes, perhaps that was why, when he returned, he could not find the words to describe it accurately. He knew that a part of himself had been displaced, as if his consciousness had touched something that human language could not capture. But he also knew it was not just him. For years afterward, he found similar descriptions in ancient myths, in the dreams of patients, in the accounts of shamans and people who had come close to death. None could paint the full picture of the experience, but they all touched on the same feeling, and that was the starting point, not of death, but of a journey into the center of oneself. Jung wrote that he did not simply drift away, having left the earth, having left behind his name, his body, his memories, and even the distinction of time. He entered a space that until the end of his life, he could not find the words to describe. He called it a temple. But then he wrote, no, not a structure of stone or wood. It did not shine. It was light. It was as if it were carved out of the very substance of the pure, not solid, not liquid, not air, not fire, but something else. In that moment, he was no longer a scientist, no longer an explorer of symbols and an analyst of dreams. He was part of what he himself had called the collective unconscious, but in its purest, unmediated form. He was no longer standing outside, observing or analyzing. The temple had no pillars, no roof, no entrance. It was just present, and he was in the midst of it, as if his soul were part of that structure. There was no sense of being lost or scrutinized. Everything was in place. Everything was safe. Jung wrote, I realized that what I had thought of as consciousness, the thing I had spent my whole life studying, was in fact only a shadow, a pale reflection of this. Human consciousness is like moonlight, illuminated by some sun deeper, farther, truer. He did not say this was heaven. He did not attach any belief system to it. He was even careful to avoid metaphysical definitions, but he asserted, "I had never felt so clear and so pure," and that is what made the experience a point of no return. In that temple of light, he did not just exist, he knew, not the kind of knowing that comes from books or experience, but the kind of knowing that cannot be doubted. No words needed, no need to reason, just perceive. What you see is not knowledge, but truth. And that truth has no form, but it can make you cry, not because it is sad, but because it touches the deepest part of you that you have ever hidden. There, he said, he encountered an entity. It had no physical form. It was neither human nor divine, but it was there, and its presence dissolved all doubts. Without words, Jung's every thought was answered immediately, by a flow of emotion and understanding, like a warm stream of water flowing through his mind. The entity did not command, did not teach, did not give truths. It was simply there like a mirror, but it reflected not the physical, but the soul. Jung wrote, "In that presence, I could not lie. I could not justify myself. I could not evade. Everything was no longer covered by the ego. Everything was clear, but not frightening, because I was seen with a non-judgmental gaze." And then something happened. Jung said he was shown himself, not through memories, but through a deeper recognition. "I don't remember my life like a movie. I recognize myself, beyond time, beyond each role, each identity. It's not like reminiscing, but like coming home after a very long journey. A place where you don't have to explain why you're there, don't have to prove your worth. You simply belong." Jung called this soul memory, a memory that cannot be put into words, but when you touch it, you know you've always been like that. And in that moment, he understood one thing: life is not just a place to live, it's a place to learn. Not just for the personality, it's for the soul. The suffering, the loss, the mistakes that seem meaningless are all part of the process of growing into the deeper self within each person. "I was shown," he wrote, "that pain is not a punishment, it is a door, that the soul grows not by joy, but by passing through darkness and remaining in the light." He paused long at this point. It was as if, even as he wrote, he could still see the image, a silent temple of light. And he, standing in the midst of it, was not asking, just silently being shown. Jung never said he had met God. He did not use the word angel, but in the way he described it, there was an undeniable sacredness, a sense that there was a greater order, inexpressible in any religion or philosophy, but that you could feel if you were quiet enough, courageous enough, humble enough. And then everything moved. Not quickly, not violently, but like a gentle wave that swept through, changing the shape of space. Jung knew he was not allowed to stay, though all of him wanted to stay there. Another part of him, deeper than his will, knew, not yet. The door did not close, it just gradually dimmed. The light remained, but he was pulled in another direction, towards the world, towards names, hospitals, voices, and in that moment, he knew he had crossed a threshold, unforgettable, irrevocable. A door opened, just for a moment, but enough to change everything you thought you knew about life, about death, and about yourself. Jung did not name the being, he did not describe it in any particular form, nor did he attach any religious or cultural attributes to it. He simply wrote, "It is not a person, nor is it a god, but I know it, as if I had been with it. It has no words, but every moment with it, I understand. There is no need for language, no need for interpretation, but a direct flow from it to me, like light touching water. The being does not teach. It does not give truths. It does not ask or command, but its presence, silent and absolute, is enough to make the rest of Jung melt away. There is no more reason, no more debate, no more self-wanting to understand. There is only one thing, the feeling of being seen, not through the eyes, but through the essence. Jung wrote, "I felt my soul opening up, as if layer upon layer of armor were being stripped away. There was nowhere to hide, but nothing to fear. It was a graced nakedness." There is something profound here. All his life, Jung had studied how people put on masks, personas, to adapt, to survive, to be loved. But now, in the presence of a non-judgmental, non-demanding presence, all those masks fell away willingly. No one forced him to take them off. But in that light, you could not hold back anything that was not true. There is no shame, there is no remorse, there is only truth, he wrote. And that truth is not in words. It is not an answer. It is an experience of absolute transparency. A place where you no longer ask yourself, "Who am I?" because you are right at the heart of that question, no longer needing to explain. Jung doesn't say he was forgiven. He doesn't say he was judged. He just felt as if everything he had ever done, right, wrong, noble, selfish, was seen. All of it. But what brought tears to his eyes was the feeling that he was still held, still accepted, naked, imperfect. There is a love that is unspoken, not as soft or romantic as people imagine, but as deep, wide, and steadfast as the earth and sky. It chooses no worthy person, because everyone is already a part of it. When you read those lines, you may feel something in your heart light up, not because you have walked through a door like Jung, but because somewhere deep inside you, you know, used to know, but have forgotten. In that moment, Jung said he was shown something else, not the past, not the future, but a state more primal than all. He was led into the memory of the soul, not a recollection of individual lives, but a profound recognition. I am always there, before this body, after it, beyond it. And then he saw faces, spirits, some unfamiliar, but familiar, some so familiar that he wept. I saw my father. I saw a child I never had. I saw people I had never known in my physical life. But in that moment, I remembered them more clearly than anyone else. It was the first time in his life, he said, that he felt a kind of connection that transcended genetics, culture, or memory. A soul bond, where there was no gender, no language, no distance. There was only belonging. What made that encounter unlike any other spiritual description was that it did not encourage him to turn away from the world. It did not offer a way out. It did not promise paradise. On the contrary, it made him want to return, to live differently. I beg to stay. Here, everything is right. Everything is still. The heart no longer hurts, no longer fears, no longer confused. But the entity, without speaking, without making any gestures, conveyed only one thing: not yet. And then, like a gentle wave pushing back, Jung felt himself gradually being pulled away from that state. Not pushed away, but given back to life, to the body, to the unfinished journey. Before leaving, he asked, with all his being, just one question: what is truth? There was no response. no image, just a vision. A tree, its roots deep in darkness, its foliage ablaze in the firelight. And he understood. Truth is not knowledge. It is not security. Truth is maturity. It is accepting the darkness. It is allowing oneself to be rooted in pain, to rise into the light. It is a nameless encounter. It is undefined. But it is a meeting that will make you never the same again if you pass by it once. And for Jung, it was a moment that his whole life, from then on, would always be a slow return in order to understand what happened on the other side of reality. Before Jung was pulled back into the physical world, he said, a strange moment occurred. It was no longer a memory, no longer an encounter, no longer an understanding. This time he stood in a different space, more vast, more abstract, and so full of meaning that he had to admit, at that moment, I did not understand what I was seeing. Only when I regained consciousness, in a fever, did I begin to write and realize it was the future. The future came to Jung not as a series of events, but as a pervasive feeling, a state of the world yet to come. No one told him, what year is this? There was no modern technology, no war or peace to name. But he saw and felt with his whole soul a world to come, very different from the one he had lived in, one towards which humanity was moving, not only with its steps, but with its state of consciousness. I saw a world where there were no longer boundaries between realms, he wrote, where people felt what they had previously called intuition or vagueness. The boundary between what was known as life and death became thin, like a mist that no longer held shape. Jung expressed this not as fear or expectation, but as a mixed feeling, like standing before a horizon so vast, so breathtakingly beautiful, yet with nowhere to hide if you were not prepared to look straight. In that world, he wrote, everything is revealed. Every emotion has a form, every thought has a voice, and every soul is naked. Jung saw people who could no longer lie, not because they were controlled, but because there was no longer any place to hide. A society where every gaze was penetrating, where falsehood simply had no place to hide. But in that light, he also saw loss. A loss that is nameless, not violent, but silent, like an unfillable void. He called it the shadowless world, a world where the light is so bright that there are no dark corners, no more pain, no more forgetting, no more mistakes. Everything is illuminated, made clear, transparent. But then he wrote, and where there are no shadows, there is no depth. This is perhaps one of Jung's strangest and most haunting lines. He did not call it hell, nor did he call it heaven. He simply described it as a state of existence where everything is bright, but the soul begins to lighten, so light that it has no weight. No more pain, no more burden, but also no more courage to understand joy. No more darkness to compare with, to recognize the brilliance of dawn. No suffering, he said, also means no more reason to forgive. No more wrong, no more idea of there's a growth. In that vision, he saw people living in absolute freedom, but there was something bewildering in their eyes. They were no longer oppressed, no longer at war, no longer dead, but they no longer asked questions. They were not in pain, but they no longer needed to understand. They were no longer running away, but they were nowhere to go. Everything was clear, so clear, that there was nothing left to search for. And at that moment, he felt a deep shudder in his soul. Not because of what he saw, but because he understood. When all truth is revealed, and man is no longer able to be wrong, then man also loses the ability to choose. And then he said, there would be people who would wake up. There would be people who would be bewildered. When the final curtain was pulled down, some would be liberated, but others would not be able to bear the naked truth. Jung called them ungrown souls. They would be lost in the very light they had longed for. That world, he wrote, is an invitation, but not everyone will understand its language. For the light does not only illuminate the truth, it also burns away all falsehood. And then what shook Jung most of all came. Before he left that vision, he heard a sentence, unspoken, but clearer than any words had ever sounded in his head. When the truth comes, it does not knock on the door. It comes through the wall. He did not know if it was a warning or a revelation. But when he woke up, still lying in his hospital bed, his heart beating weakly, he could only whisper to himself one thing: not everyone is ready for the light. And he understood why he had to return. Not to teach, not to prophesy, but to prepare, to sow seeds, to leave signs, to send messages through symbols, images, dreams, so that when that moment comes, the moment when the world will stand between two shores, someone like you now will open an old letter and begin to remember what he thought he had forgotten. Not a knowledge, but a truth. Not something new, but yourself, when there is nothing left to hide. And in that final moment, Jung wrote a sentence that he crossed out and then copied again, with a trembling hand. Slowly, I see a world that is no longer dead, but in which the soul begins to sleep. Awakening does not come from the absence of suffering. It comes from daring to go through it. The moment Jung realized he had to go back was not like waking from a dream. It was not as gentle as a morning awakening. It was a silent resistance in the soul, as if every cell were screaming, clinging to the light, refusing to return to gravity, to the name, to that pulsating body. But he knew, even though no one had forced him, even though no one had commanded him, some deep part of him knew it was not time. The journey was not over. There was something to be done, not for his reputation, not for his doctrine, but for his soul itself. Jung heard the voice, not as clear as a voice, but as a certainty that rang out from all directions, inescapable: go back. And then he felt the heaviness return. Not physical, but a slow, pressing pressure on his consciousness, like being plunged back into a lower, denser, more limited plane. When he opened his eyes, he saw the hospital ceiling, the yellow light, the sound of machines. No more lights, no more brilliant wisdom, just a white room with the smell of antiseptic and the doctor calling his name. And the pain, which he had temporarily forgotten, returned like a cut, reminding him that he had returned to his body, to his limits, to life. But he was no longer the same person. That was clear. Something had left him in the departure, and something else, quieter, more solid, deeper, had replaced it. The Carl Jung who opened his eyes was not the Carl Jung before his heart attack. No longer the psychoanalyst who had only searched for symbols and dreams. Now he was the one who had stepped out of the boundary, seen, and brought a part of it back. Not everything can be taken with you, he wrote in his first post-recovery notebook. What I saw for the most part was beyond words, but something remained with me, like a burning that never went out, an echo that never left my bones. And from then on, he began to change, not in theory, but in the way he lived, the way he listened, the way he read the old symbols. He stopped trying to decode people as malfunctioning mechanisms. Instead, he began to listen to pain as a language, a whisper from the soul struggling to grow. Many noticed that he became quieter, deeper. His writings on astrology, on alchemy, on ancient mystical traditions increased markedly. He began to collect the traces, the spiritual maps left by his ancestors, no longer as a critic, but as a pathfinder. Jung understood that he was not the first to pass through that door. Many people, from native shamans to Greek hermits, from the gravely ill to ancient poets, had seen the temple of light. But because human language could not contain it, they were forced to speak in metaphors, in myths, in fragments of symbols. And he realized that if he truly wanted to share what he had experienced, he could not write a medical report, nor could he present it as a scientific presentation. He had to write like a sower, putting each symbol, each fragment of metaphor, in the right place, at the right time, so that one day someone, like you now, would encounter it and recognize it. Jung called it the language of the soul, a language that has no dictionary, no grammar, but that everyone understands if they stop long enough, if they are quiet enough to hear what is ringing from within. In his later years, he didn't talk much about death, not because he was afraid, but because he knew there was no need to talk anymore. Those who had touched that boundary no longer saw life the same way. They lived differently, loved differently, silenced differently. They didn't need to prove it, nor were they in a hurry, because they had seen what was waiting behind the thin veil of reality. "I am no longer afraid of death," he wrote, "but what bothered me was how to live properly after having seen it." And that was the gift, and also the responsibility, that he brought back from that journey. Not knowledge, not doctrine, but an invitation to live mindfully, as if every moment were a miracle, as if every person we met were a lesson, a mirror helping us to recognize the forgotten part of ourselves. After returning, he continued to heal, to teach, to write. But in his eyes, there was always something far away, a gaze no longer bound to roles, to intellectual debates, a gaze that seemed to be listening to something behind each story, as if he were always waiting for something deeper to be said. And he continued to listen like that, until the end of his life. Jung never published that letter. He did not include it in a book. He did not mention it in lectures. He left it, carefully, privately, as a message for the future. And now, it has found you. The question is no longer, is this true? But among the countless things you have read, believed, doubted, what part of you does this touch? Because if you really listen, you will realize that letter is not just about a person, it is about a part of you, the part that has known, has seen, and is quietly waiting for you to return. If you have come this far, if you are still reading, silently absorbing each line, as if they were not just words but the pulse of something deeper, then perhaps this is no longer Jung's story. Jung did not write that letter to tell his story. He did not need to be honored. He did not seek attention. He lived his whole life in light and doubt, in knowledge and doubt. But the only thing he had left after that experience was a simple wish to leave a sign, a guide, an invitation to those who feel that something in this world is no longer complete, no longer enough. An invitation for you. Have you ever felt that way? A very small moment, not bright, not noisy. Maybe a dream you will never forget. A time when you stand in front of nature and feel time disappear. A time when you look into someone's eyes and realize that you once knew them, even though you cannot explain why. Or a moment in the night when all is quiet and you feel someone listening to you from the other side of reality. Jung believed that we are all called at some point in our lives, not by someone outside, not by a god or a mystical messenger, but by the deepest part of ourselves, the part that never ages, the part that existed before the name, before the form, and that silently guides us every step of the way. He called it the self, the divine essence that every religion, every mystical tradition has touched, under different names. And when you hear that call, perhaps through illness, loss, breakup, or simply a moment of silence, you can no longer live as before. You begin to search, but not outwardly, but inwardly, towards yourself. Jung once wrote, "When you turn inward and face the darkness, the first thing you will find is fear. But if you keep walking, you will find light. And then you will find that they are one." Maybe you have already begun that journey. Maybe you are in the middle of it. Or maybe you are standing at the first door. But the important thing is not how far you have come. It is that you are going. The letter that Jung left behind, with all its transcendent experiences, its indescribable images, its emotions that no words can capture, is not a map. It does not tell you what to believe, what to do, where to go. It is a whisper, a mirror, a question. That if death is not the end, if your soul really did exist before this life, how would you live differently? Would you continue to hide in roles, continue to run after what others expect? Will you miss the most real moments, the silent hugs, the rains you feared, the mornings you never listened to? Or will you stop, not to give up, but to remember, to live each beat as if it were a gift, because you once knew how fragile that gift is? Jung lived the rest of his life like that, with silence, with a distant gaze, and with patience for each lost soul. He did not try to awaken anyone. He only left fragments, in books, in symbols, in strange sayings, that one had to read many times to understand. Because he knew, everyone will have their turn. No one is left behind, but no one can rush, and now he leaves you with this. If you are reading this, you have heard the call. It is very light, like the wind passing through a window, like footsteps passing through a dream. But if you do not turn away, if you do not forget quickly, it will lead you on. This journey has no name. There is no map, but you are not alone. Every awakened person is a small light. And when you begin to remember, you are lighting yourself up. When the truth comes, it does not shout. It only asks one thing: have you lived as yourself? Not whether you have succeeded, been loved, done anything for the world, but have you become what your soul wants to become? Jung does not answer for you. He only opens the door. The rest is your step. And if you have listened this far, perhaps you have already begun. Go slowly, be quiet when necessary, and believe that something divine is waiting for you, not at the end of the road, but right in this very moment where you are.